everybody, it's Courtney. I'm back here with another video for Trinity Stamps. Today, again, I'm going to be using the Spring Fling Florals stamp set, as well as the matching dies, as well as the Hello Sentimini stamp set. I'm going to be doing a little bit of watercoloring, so I have a piece of Canson watercolor paper here, and I have this taped down to a board just to avoid warping, or to minimize it at least. So I saturated the entire card panel with clean water, and then I'm just dropping in a teeny tiny bit of color and kind of just letting it spread out on its own. And then I'm going to take this darker color. Now keep in mind that this will dry back. So once it dries, it's going to be pretty, quite a bit lighter. So once I have that spread out, I'm going to go ahead and flick on some of that darker color and kind of let that spread a little bit, and then I'll put that aside to dry. Next, I'm going to bring out another piece of the Canson watercolor paper, and I'm using my Misty here because I am going to be stamping my images multiple times so that I can actually see them. I'm going to be using antique linen distress ink, and I'm using the traditional distress ink. I just find that that gives better results when watercoloring, but you can certainly use the oxides. You can also use any light color ink that you have. So I'm kind of just spreading these out because I know I'm going to be die cutting these, so I want to make sure that I leave enough space in between each one of the images to fit those dies once everything is done. Again, going to go ahead and stamp this with the antique linen. I stamped this, I think, a total of 3 times because some of the flowers are pretty intricate and I need to be able to see the lines. And I'm stamping on textured paper. Watercolor paper, cold press watercolor paper is textured, so sometimes you don't get a great impression the first time. Well, most of the time you don't get a great impression, no matter if you use a stamp positioner or an acrylic block. So it's easiest if you do use a stamp positioner and you can stamp that multiple times. So I'm not going to show you all of the watercoloring here. I'm just going to show you a few of the different techniques that I am using currently. I'm very new to watercoloring. I've been practicing a lot. So for this first flower here, I am using a pink color, and I'm using Arteza watercolors here, by the way. And I'm going in with a diluted, meaning my brush is pretty wet, with picking up some of that pigment and basically spreading that all around the petal. Then I'm dropping in a little bit of this purplish color to kind of change the color a little bit and have a little bit of variation. I am working on petals that are not touching so that they don't kind of merge together and end up with one big blob, basically. So you want to make sure that you're working with 2 areas next to each other that are dry. We're going to move on to the leaves while those petals dry, and for this one, I'm using the lighter green here, and I'm putting a little bit of color on the base of the leaf. Then I'm cleaning off my paintbrush, dabbing that off on a paper towel, and spreading that color to the tip of the leaf. I've also used that same green and mixed it with a little bit of black just to get a really dark green, and that will be basically my shadow areas. Now these leaves are not soaking wet. They're just basically damp. So I'm going to go in with that darker green and just add a little bit of darker color to the base of the leaf and let that spread out on its own. If it's not spreading the way you want it to, it probably means that the paper's not wet enough. Just go in with a damp paintbrush and you can kind of guide it where you want it. Going back to these petals, and I'm using a darker pink here, and I'm just going to add in my very darkest areas. So basically where one petal is laying under another, just darken those areas up so that once all of my watercoloring is done for that flower, there is some differentiation between one petal and the next. You'll see that I'll go back to the same areas multiple times. Once it dries, it will look completely different. So if you're in the middle of watercoloring and you're not liking the way it's looking, let it sit, let it dry, let the colors blend together and see what the results are. With watercolor, you can always go back and change it. You can either add more or you can take it away just by using some clean water and dabbing it up with a paper towel. For this leaf, I'm doing the same thing as I did for the others, but this one is kind of folded over on itself. So that little folded area, I'm not putting any color in yet because I want that to be the lightest area. I don't plan on adding any shading there. So I'm just going to let that leaf sit and dry, and then I'll go back later and add that little fold of the leaf. Going back to this flower, now that those petals that we had started off with are dry, I can start moving on to different petals on this flower, just making sure that the two petals that I'm working on are not touching in any way. Even the slightest bit, even if they meet in the middle, you'll have those colors blend in areas you don't want it to. So just be super careful with that. Here I'm going back to this leaf and adding a little bit more of a deeper shadow where it is folded over on itself. That would be the darkest area of that particular leaf. So I did go back a couple of times and add a little bit more, just keeping in mind that watercolors do dry back. And for the most part, all watercolors will do that, with the exception of the Zig Clean Color Real Brush Markers. I find that they don't dry back at all. So I'm just finishing up these additional leaves on this little stem here and making sure that those leaves are completely dry before I add any color to the stem, because like I said, that color will bleed through. So basically going around this entire flower here, doing the same thing, just making sure that the petals are dry before moving on to the next. Once my leaves were completely dry, I'm going to bring in that darkest green that we had created by mixing in the black. And I'm just going to, well, first I did this fold, so I'm going in with a lighter green and just adding a little bit of color there, and then going right over the stem with the darkest color for both of the leaves. So I'm going to go basically straight through for this little stem here with multiple leaves on it, and that way my darkest areas will kind of meet up, if that makes any sense to you. So the base of the leaves are going to be the darkest. So once my flowers were finished, I'm just going to go in with like a golden yellow to fill in the centers. The centers are super tiny, so I'm not worried about doing any shading there. Next, we're going to move on to this next flower here, and I'm going to be doing this one a little bit different. So I'm going to go ahead and I have an orange, and then I mixed that same orange with a little bit of red just to get a little bit darker of an orange. I'm going to pick up that lightest with a damp paintbrush. You can see that I'm dabbing off on my paper towel each and every time. Again, going to go ahead and add my darkest color down, or my darkest areas down. Then clean off my paintbrush, dab that off on the paper towel, and I'm going to start with the tip of the petal this time and work my way down to the base of the petal where we had put that color, and kind of just let the water and the pigment do its thing. Let it spread on its own. Once I have the petal dry for just a minute or two, so it's still damp, but it's not as wet as when I started off with, I'm going to pick up a little bit of the darker orange that we had created by mixing in that red, and just add that to the very darkest areas. But I am waiting for the petal to be almost dry so that it doesn't spread further than I want it to. If you go in when it's still really wet, it's just going to spread throughout the whole petal and you're going to have one big blob of dark orange. So I know it just takes a lot of practice, and trust me, I've been practicing with watercolor a lot lately because I do want to get good at it, and I find that the amount of water makes all the difference in the world. So just knowing how much water you need on the paper and how much you need on your brush makes a huge difference. So I went ahead and finished watercoloring all of my flowers with the same type of techniques that I showed you for these three. And then I am going to use the coordinating dies, stick those down with some Post-it note tape so they don't shift around through my Gemini. And then I'm going to bring back out my panel here that we had started off with for my background. I'm going to first trim this down because I did have this stuck down with some washi tape I think I used. So I do have a little bit of a border there. So this is just going to be a little bit smaller than an A2 size card. And I'm going to just kind of arrange my flowers to see how I want them. I'm not going to stick anything down yet. This is just basically to get an idea of how I'm going to place everything, what needs to be stuck down to the card panel, and what flowers need to be popped up. So once I had my placement and I was pretty happy with that placement, I'm just going to kind of take a mental note there, or you can take a picture with your cell phone so you can refer back to it if needed. And then I'm going to go ahead and remove those, glue my panel down to an A2 size top folding white note card, and I'm using my Tombow Mono Multi Glue here. Because my paper is a little bit warped, you want to add a little bit of pressure and make sure that this glue really sticks, or else you're going to have corners that kind of peel up a little bit. So once that was done, I'm going to go ahead and rearrange those flowers back the same way I had them. Lift the three main flowers, or the three largest flowers that I have in the center of my little arrangement, and I'm going to stick the leaves and the little buds that I have kind of sticking out the center. Those are going to be glued straight down. So I'm using my Tombow Mono Multi Glue again. I prefer to use wet glue. You can certainly use double-sided tape or a tape runner here, but this just gives me a couple extra seconds to move it around if I need to. And before I pop up these main flowers in the center, I want to create my sentiment strip that will be kind of coming out from the middle of my little bouquet here. So I'm bringing out the Hello Sentimenty stamp set and a piece of scrap black cardstock here. I'm going to go ahead and treat that cardstock with my anti-static tool. I'm just using my grid mat here to line up the stamps that I'm going to be using from the Hello Sentimenty stamp set. They're pretty much all separate words or separate phrases, so you can kind of piece together whatever phrase you want. So I'm just using my grid mat, making sure those are lined up perfectly before popping those onto my acrylic block. Once my cardstock was treated with my anti-static tool, I'm going to go ahead and stamp out my sentiment with Versamark ink. Sprinkle on some white embossing powder and heat set that, making sure that my heat gun is completely heated up before bringing that to the paper to avoid or minimize as much of the warping as I possibly can. Then I'll go ahead and trim this down into a skinny little strip, just slightly larger than the sentiment itself. I'm going to cut the one side or the right side off at an angle just to add a little bit of added interest there. And then I'm going to go ahead and pop everything up. Now here is where I struggled just a little bit. So I'm putting the foam tape down on all three of my larger flowers here. And the great thing about using the foam tape on watercolor paper is that until you press down hard, you can move it around. Where if it's just regular cardstock, sometimes you can't. Once it's down, it's down. So this gives you a couple of extra minutes until you add additional pressure to kind of move things around, which is good because I had to move things around quite a bit. Once I got those first two flowers down, I just couldn't get that sentiment strip to fit the way I wanted it to with that third flower. So I did have to kind of mess around with this a little bit, but I finally did get it. And that is the card. That is the card for today. Thank you guys so much for stopping by. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Trinity Stamps channel. I will leave the supplies listed below. Thanks a lot, guys. Bye.